Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Zeynep Gökçe. It was a closely watched trip rich in symbolism and substance. Pope Leo XIV began his first overseas journey with an official visit to Türkiye. In Ankara, he met with President Erdoğan, where discussions centered on promoting peace and humanitarian relief. Both sides placed particular emphasis on the deepening crisis in Gaza and broader Mediterranean challenges. The visit continued in Istanbul and Iznik, where the Pope toured historic sites including Sultan Ahmed Mosque and an ancient basilica linked to early Christian history. He also met with representatives from Christian denominations and expressed appreciation for Türkiye's humanitarian efforts across the Middle East. Throughout the trip, Ankara underscored its long-standing commitment to preserving its cultural heritage and identity as a bridge between civilizations. The Pope echoed that message, highlighting Türkiye's significant role in the region's future. On the second leg of his journey, Pope Leo arrived in Lebanon, where recent Israeli airstrikes have heightened tensions and threatens a fragile truce. For more, joining me now from Rome is Valeria Gianotta, the scientific director of the Türkiye Observatory at the Center for International Political Studies. From Istanbul, Vehbi Baysan, associate professor at Ibn Haldun University. And also from Istanbul, Şuay Nilhan Açıkalın, associate professor at Ankara Hacı Bayram Veli University. Thank you all for joining me. Now, Pope Leo XIV has wrapped up his trip to Türkiye, his 4-day trip, and it was actually the first stop of his foreign visits. So, Valeria, what broader political or diplomatic messages does the Vatican hope to send with this trip?
I think we have to start from the symbol, the logo of the trip that Pope Leo XIV chose for his trip to Türkiye. Indeed, in the logo, there is a bridge. Therefore, he considers and he looks at Türkiye as a bridge, physically as a bridge between the East and the West, between Asia and Europe, but also, as he mentioned, the bridge between the past and the future, and the bridge in terms of dialogue between cultures, between states, and between faiths. Indeed, he clearly pointed out and recognized by acknowledging the role of Türkiye as a bridge maker in terms of mediation and dialogue and negotiations in the most thorny conflicts that they are affecting the international system as well. He advocated also the role of Ankara in terms of a dialogue maker with many other actors in the region and international level, as well as domestically. He pointed out that Türkiye is an example in terms of peaceful coexistence and in terms of multiculturality, peaceful coexistence, therefore can be as a model also in engaging with other states. I would like also to say that yesterday, while leaving Türkiye, the Pope really stressed, while flying towards Lebanon, the role of Türkiye as the only country, the only actor able to make peace between Russia and Ukraine, and also infers the great role of Türkiye in terms of calling for ceasefire related to the Gaza, the Israeli war on Gaza. Therefore, I think those are the main elements that they pushed the Pope to start his trip to Türkiye, besides the historical element that it was the 1,700 years since the first council of Nicaea, where the basis of the ecumenical church were laid back, centuries ago. So we have this religious and ecumenical connotation, but beside that, the trip was also a diplomatic and politically oriented trip.
And this visit took place upon Turkish President Erdoğan's personal invitation to the Pope. So, Vehbi, what's your take on this evolving relationship between the diplomatic relationship between Türkiye and the Vatican?
Well, shortly, and it's a peace diplomacy. Basically, I was following carefully the visit, and especially on the social media, they were counting how many times the Pope mentioned peace, not only here, but also in his trip in Lebanon as well. So the international community drew an attention to that very fact. So basically, we can see that Turkey's significant role in the Middle East as a mediator, as a peace partner. And basically, they're doing all they can do at the highest level possible to establish that, especially at times of crisis as such, we know in Gaza and elsewhere as well. Not only that, but what Turkey trying to do between Russia and Ukraine, and also in Iraq and even in Sudan. So basically, this is a peace diplomacy, and that 4 days was very fruitful in my view. All the messages were very clear: peace as soon as possible, so that people can continue their daily life.
Shuay, could you tell us more about the significance of this visit, but for regional stability, considering Turkey's role as a mediator in conflicts and its foreign policy priorities?
Thank you very much. Turkey has been playing a very key role in the regional crisis. Doesn't matter the religion or the conflict in which region has been taken. If we can see in the very concrete example in Russian-Ukrainian war, at the same time we see a clear and a concrete example of the Gaza. And I think it's very important to address that how the Turkey approached the mediating in its foreign policy. It's also very important what the Pope Leo XIV basically underlined in his speech. And the Turkey in this role playing a key role of the bridge between the conflictual sides. And at the same time, Turkey has been a very important player for the both sides of the conflicts as a reliable partner and a trustable actor when it comes to the negotiation and the mediating. And besides of these two realities, it's also very important to see that it doesn't matter the religion of the conflictual sides. Turkey are always ready to help in terms of the humanitarian aid. And I think it also shows that what Valeria and VP Hoca mentioned, that Turkey's clear position as a peace diplomacy and of course the mediation capacity.
Yes, and this visit by Pope Leo is the 5th Pope visit to Turkey. So, Valeria, can you briefly summarize the history of Vatican-Turkey diplomatic relations and past papal visits to help us understand the significance of this latest visit?
Yes, the bilateral relations were fully established back into the 1960s, but also before we had, the Vatican had a very leading figure in Turkey, Pope Roncalli, who at the time after the Second World War was the delegated from Vatican to Turkey, and he left such a good memories in our heritage by writing extensively on Turkey and Turkey hospitality and how attached the Christianity and himself felt to Turkey. After him, actually, the relations were established, and the first Pope coming to Turkey was Paul VI. And then we had John II. Then when actually he landed to Turkey in 1979, he literally kissed the ground by recognizing Turkey as the cradle of Christianity. And he really said, we are at home. And then after Pope John Paul II, we had Benedict XVI, that actually he came to Turkey. In Istanbul, he also prayed in the Blue Mosque, as also Pope Francis did. And actually, along with that visit, some criticalities came up, because before the visit, Benedict XVI actually in Ratisbon made such a critical statement regarding Turkey's accession to European Union. So the environment wasn't that calm, I would like to say, from the Vatican point of view, because the hospitality that Turkey granted to the Pope was always excellent. Pope Francis actually came to Turkey 2 times. The first time in 2014, when he stayed in Istanbul, he prayed literally in the Blue Mosque. He met with the civil community as well. And then he back to Turkey in Ankara just to a political visit to President Erdoğan in 2019. During his tenure, the relations were pretty good. And between Pope Francis and President Erdoğan, actually there was always a very peaceful and mutual sympathy relations. Indeed, they had a regular call overall in the last time of Pope Francis by addressing the genocide unfolding in Gaza. And now we had, and actually it was Pope Francis that he arranged the trip, he organized by in the first hand the trip to Turkey. And then after he passed away, Pope Leo took the heritage.
And on the, as part of his visit, Pope Leo also celebrated a special mass in Istanbul, and there was a mosaic of people from different backgrounds. So, Vehbi, what does this event say about Turkey's approach to religious freedom?
Well, that actually further confirms, in my view, the historical stand, starting with the Ottoman Empire from the 13th century onwards. In fact, we should be very careful as historians. It's not tolerance, it is the policy and the strategy and happily coexisting together, because the Muslim and non-Muslim communities throughout centuries lived side by side, sharing the same views and values. They existed, and that actually you can see later in the 20th century, early 20th century, just a little bit jeopardized. But now we can see the way Turkey looking into other faiths and sects, not only religions, but different ideas, that we can still coexist. We don't have to create a conflict and live in crisis. So the faith, very important, and it's quite central to today's governmental policies, ministerial policies. We can see in the, let me call it old Istanbul, the Istanbul that within city walls, some of the churches, especially the one at the Golden Horn, the Bulgarian church we call, or the big iron church, has been restored. And President Erdoğan personally attended opening of it. Because I live in the area, I can see many of the other churches and synagogues also went through restoration. So this is the respect other people's faith and promotion of it, and I believe it's going to continue this way.
All right, and there's also an alignment between Pope Leo's messages on migration and climate change and Turkey's efforts in these areas. So, Shuay, how would you expect this to influence diplomatic discussions or public awareness on these issues?
Of course, these two issues, why these two issues is also important to emphasize to understand the answers, because two issues are the global issues, the humanity issues, which is shared by the all countries, all cultures, and all peoples across the world. That's why migration and the climate change has a different point of view in the respect of the global issues. First of all, in terms of the migration issue, and clearly we know that Turkey has been hosting more than 3 million refugees, and Turkey are generally so generous towards the migration related with the refugees as well. On the other hand, the climate change, we have just had the news a few weeks ago. Turkey will be the owner of the COP31 in next year. So in both sense, Turkey has been clearly shows lots of efforts in diplomatic way and the humanitarian aid way. In this respect, it's also important to emphasize by the Pope Leo XIV in his speech that these two important concepts in international relations, because Turkey has been playing a very key role. At the same time, Turkey shows a lot of contribution in terms of the migration management at international level, as well as the addressing the consequences of the climate change. And finally, it's also to be understanding that the Turkey's contribution regarding the regional and the global peace also contributing the solution of those problems in the international relation, and it will be an important steps that taken by the Turkey in upcoming years will be determined.
Yes, and the Pope's next stop was Lebanon, as we mentioned earlier, which is currently dealing with Israeli airstrikes. But Valeria, what do these trips signal about the priorities and direction of his pontificate?
Definitely, the main meaning is just working for peace and stabilization, and also by recognizing also the need of creating a ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, in order also the need of marginalize the Israeli aggressive role in the region, considered as the main destabilizing actor. As well as in Lebanon, he will recognize and they will grant support to the Christian communities there. And I think this is a visit of crucial importance after Turkey, under the scope, as Shuai and Vebio just said, of peace diplomacy and getting aligned perfectly with Turkey in terms of need for stabilization, global peace, and just marginalizing the risky factor for the sake of coexistence, dialogue, and stability.
So we talked about Turkey's approach to religious freedom, but I want to talk about its approach to cultural and historical heritage. Anatolia has hosted diverse religions and civilizations for thousands of years, and Turkey has launched programs over the decades to ensure their preservation. So Vehbi, I know you gave one example, but I want to hear more of those examples. How committed is Turkey in safeguarding its multi-layered historical heritage? And what are some other examples you can give us of the restoration work that's been done or being done in the country?
Well, let me begin with, again, the policy of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. In today's Istanbul, you can see very fine architectural examples of monasteries and churches preserved from since the beginning of Ottoman Empire, and they were kept as they are. A good example is again the Karia Museum, now the multifunction structure we have there, and Hagia Sophia, as well as the Zeyrek Cami, etc. But beside all these worship places, you can find others like synagogues, especially like Castoria Synagogue. They're trying, even not only the governmental level, but I can see the locals, including myself, trying to preserve it. And the area of Balat Fener, you can see many fine examples. Let's go to Iznik this year, because the significance of it for Christians and Muslims, I see it as part of their heritage, but not only part of their heritage, it's a human heritage, it's the international heritage. Therefore, they're doing utmost work to preserve it. We also have examples in the eastern part of remote areas. The churches also under restoration, or the restoration has been completed. And let me say this because our government officials often don't. Many of the expenditure and millions of dollars actually compensated by Turkish government or Ministry of Culture.
Yes, all right. And Shuai, I want to talk about Turkey-EU relations. Could the Pope's visit have broader implications on this relationship? Could it strengthen cultural diplomacy? Could it shape Europe's perception of Turkey as a country that bridges civilizations?
Oh, well, if you ask me, this is one of the tough questions, because it's not about only the Turkish perspective, but it's also not easy question regarding the EU perspective. Of course, it should be expected to have a positive contribution, but on the other hand, Turkey-EU relations somehow has been evolved right now, seems to be a bit positive atmosphere due to the security reasons and the changing security landscape of the European Union. And together with the visits of the Pope Leo XIV, it seems that the Turkey is clearly show that Turkey has been a cradle of the different civilization that should be also considered one of the important pillars regarding the EU values. But unfortunately, the Brussels sometimes just only the anti-Turkey position shape the Turkey's policies of the Brussels, and it seems to be a very unstrategic in last decade, and it would be expected to upcoming times to see much more positive rapprochement between the Turkey and EU. And President Erdoğan already mentioned that Turkey has been ready to talk to EU in a more deep integration sense, but also we need to see some positive steps from the Brussels as well. So both together with the strategic realities and the Turkey's potential and realities of capacities regarding the cultural diplomacy, and in this respect of the Pope visit to Turkey, should be considered as a positive contribution if the Brussels have if the Brussels doesn't have a strategic blindness towards the Turkey.
And there's a American Pope now in the Vatican, and then there's a US President saying he can quickly end conflict. So, Valeria, what kind of dynamic do you think could emerge between Washington and the Vatican, especially in areas where Turkey is directly involved?
It's harder to say because the American leadership is quite unpredictable nowadays. I mean, Donald Trump is not so predictable, I will say. But the fact that for the first time in the history we have an American Pope, it marks a difference. First of all, because Pope Leo XIV has been the first Pope and the only one that he does not deliver the speech in Italian or in Latin, but directly in English. So this is a very symbolic element because his messages are universal and immediately delivered to the public audience at international level. When he was appointed back to May, we had the feeling that he could counterbalance and he could balance the tough stance of this American administration when it comes to conflicts and war, and overall when it comes to the war of Israel on Gaza, by following to some extent what was the strategic line drawn by Pope Francis that he used to call the church in Gaza every night, and he called also to end the genocide, and literally he had the courage to speak about genocide in the West. So what we perceive, at least in the Western world, in the Christian world, we look at Pope Leo XIV as a balancing actor, also in terms of relations with US related to international politics. And I do believe that this alignment with Turkey related to the needs of peace and stability, and given also the renewed relationship between Washington and Ankara, can play as in a positive way, basically in mediating and containing the unpredictability of the Washington administration nowadays.
Yes, and I want to go back to that logo, because during the press conference of Pope Leo and President Erdoğan, the Pope highlighted that they choose this image of Çanakkale Bridge as the logo of his journey because to highlight Turkey's role as a connector between the East and the West. So, Vehbi, how do you interpret this message in terms of Turkey's current geopolitical positioning?
Well, first we should congratulate whoever created that logo. Also, the Pope referring to that image, which is true. Turkey for centuries was a bridge between the gap between East and West, and all the international politics, current policies, in fact, also confirming that. Because as Shai mentioned here, as Valerie talking about, is that whenever there's a conflict, we've had one in Iraq, we had many thousands of Iraqis hosted in Turkey, millions of Syrians did that, and also Ukrainian war, over 500,000 Ukrainians had to come and hosted in Turkey. So basically, Turkey living in a very difficult and challenging geography. But nevertheless, you can see that our policies as a peace diplomacy is achieving as much as they can do to be bridging between the two, mediating between the two sides, wherever it is, just to assure the peace in the area. Now, Turkey is helping rebuilding Syria, also trying to involve international organizations to have an active role there. But we can see between Ukraine and Russia, Turkey is trying to do the same thing. When, especially a couple of years ago, we had a grain deal, the food prices only increased because Ukrainian grain wasn't, kind of allowed to be shipped out, etc. So you can see these are quite significant. And the Pope referring to that role, Turkey's role between East and West, is highly appreciated. I can see in Turkish social media, our friends, academics sharing with each other, which is It's well received by the both sides.
Vehbi, Shuai, Valeria, thank you all for joining me on Straight Talk. That's all the time we had. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Zeynep Gökçe. If you've got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.